In a quiet little town surrounded by green fields and rolling hills, there lived a woman who had spent her entire life working on the land her family owned. The land wasn't just soil and crops to her. It was memories, sweat, and love passed down through generations. Her father had worked on it until his last breath, and now it was her turn to take care of it. But life has a way of testing people when they least expect it. One day she fell seriously ill. It wasn't anything life-threatening, but it left her too weak to manage the farm alone. She needed help, someone trustworthy who could step in while she recovered. That's when she turned to her childhood friend, a person she thought she could rely on completely. This friend had always been charming, full of energy, and seemed genuinely interested in helping others. So without hesitation, she handed over temporary control of the property, believing it would only be for a short while. At first, everything seemed fine. The friend took charge, promised to handle things responsibly, and assured her that the land would remain safe. But as weeks turned into months, something felt off. Letters started arriving, letters about parts of the land being sold or leased out. At first, she dismissed them as mistakes, thinking maybe there had been miscommunication. But then came the developers. Big trucks rolled onto the property, tearing up sections of the land to build houses. Panic set in. What was happening? How could this happen? She began digging deeper. With each passing day, the truth became clearer and more painful. Her so-called friend hadn't just taken care of the land. They had manipulated documents behind her back. Signatures were forged, papers altered, and suddenly, chunks of her precious inheritance didn't belong to her anymore. They belonged to someone else entirely. And worse still, her friend was making money off these deals, selling pieces of the land to wealthy buyers looking to build fancy homes. The betrayal cut deep. This wasn't just about losing land. It was about losing trust. Someone she had known since childhood, someone she had called a friend, had stolen from her. Not just stolen, but done it in such a calculated way that it left her feeling powerless. Every time she looked at the fields, she saw not just her father's hard work disappearing, but also her future crumbling before her eyes. Determined to fight back, she decided she wouldn't let this slide. She couldn't afford expensive lawyers, but she refused to give up. She started gathering evidence, every document, every email, every conversation that hinted at what her friend had done. It wasn't easy. There were days when she felt overwhelmed, like the world was against her. People whispered behind her back, saying it was probably all a misunderstanding or that she should just move on. But she knew better. Deep down, she knew justice had to be served. As she pieced together the puzzle, one thing became clear. Her friend wasn't acting alone. There were others involved. People with influence, people who didn't want her poking around too much. But instead of scaring her away, this realization fueled her determination even more. She realized that if she wanted to win, she'd have to play smart. She couldn't match their resources, but she could outthink them. She started learning everything she could about property laws, talking to experts, and finding loopholes that might work in her favor. But amidst all this chaos, something unexpected caught her attention. While investigating, she stumbled upon a piece of information that changed everything. Her friend, the same person who had betrayed her, was living in a beautiful house built right on one of the stolen parcels of land. This discovery hit her like a lightning bolt. For the first time since this nightmare began, she saw an opportunity, not just to reclaim what was hers, but to strike back in a way no one would see coming. The idea formed slowly at first, almost like a seed taking root. What if she could buy that house? What if she could turn the tables and make her friend feel the same vulnerability she had felt? It sounded crazy, almost impossible. After all, how could she afford it? But the more she thought about it, the more it made sense. If she played her cards right, she could hit her friend where it hurt the most, right in their own home. This plan gave her a renewed sense of purpose. Instead of focusing solely on the legal battles, she shifted her strategy. She kept fighting. In court, yes, but she also started researching ways to acquire the house. She reached out to real estate agents discreetly, asking questions and exploring options. She found creative ways to finance the purchase, borrowing money from trusted allies and using every resource at her disposal. And then one day it happened. The house went up for sale. Her friend, it turned out, was drowning in debt due to reckless spending and bad investments. Desperate for cash, they listed the house without realizing its significance to her. When she saw the listing, a mix of emotions washed over her: anger, satisfaction, and a strange kind of hope. This was her chance, her golden opportunity to take back some control. With careful planning and a lot of nerve, she managed to secure the house. She bought it under a company name, keeping her identity hidden until the very last moment. The look on her friend's face when they found out who the new owner was? Priceless. Shock quickly turned to anger, but there was nothing they could do. Legally, the house was hers now. This victory wasn't just symbolic, it was strategic. Owning the house gave her leverage, a way to put pressure on her friend while continuing the legal battle. More importantly, it gave her a sense of power she hadn't felt in years. For the first time, she felt like she was finally gaining the upper hand. Little did her friend know, this was only the beginning. The fight was far from over. While buying the house felt like a monumental step, it was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. Winning back the stolen land wasn't going to be easy, especially when her opponent seemed to have all the advantages: money, connections, and influence within the community. But she didn't care about any of that anymore. All she cared about was justice. And if playing dirty was what it took, then so be it. She hired a lawyer, scraping together every penny she had saved over the years. It wasn't enough to cover hefty legal fees, but she managed to strike a deal with the lawyer, a small upfront payment and the rest once the case was won. She knew it was risky, but she didn't have another option. Every document, every forged signature, every shady transaction needed to be exposed. Her lawyer warned her that this wouldn't be quick or simple. The other side would drag things out, file endless appeals, and try to wear her down emotionally and financially. But she nodded, determined. She had already come too far to back out now. The first few months were brutal. Court dates were postponed repeatedly, documents mysteriously went missing, and witnesses suddenly became unavailable. It was clear that her opponent wasn't fighting fair. They had friends in high places, people who could pull strings and make life difficult for anyone standing in their way. She often found herself wondering if she was strong enough to keep going. Late at night, sitting alone in the house she had bought, she questioned whether this battle was worth it. Was it worth losing sleep, peace of mind, and possibly everything she owned? But then she'd look out the window at the fields beyond, the ones her father had worked on, the ones that held decades of family history, and she'd remind herself why she started this fight in the first place. One day, during a particularly frustrating court hearing, something unexpected happened. A man approached her after the session ended. He introduced himself as a former employee of her opponent, someone who had helped process some of the fraudulent paperwork. He claimed he had evidence, emails, contracts, and even recordings, that proved her opponent's guilt. At first, she was skeptical. Could this be a trap? Or worse, a setup designed to derail her case further? But something in his tone felt genuine. Desperate and scared, yes, but honest. She decided to take a chance. Meeting secretly in a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town, they exchanged information. The man handed over files stored on an old USB drive. As she scrolled through them later that evening, her heart raced. This was it, the proof she had been searching for. Detailed records showed how signatures had been forged, how land titles had been manipulated, and how money had changed hands under the table. For the first time since this nightmare began, she allowed herself a moment of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she could win this. But having evidence wasn't enough. She needed to use it wisely. With her lawyer's guidance, she filed formal complaints against not only her opponent but also several officials implicated in the scheme. The goal wasn't just to reclaim her land, it was to expose the corruption that had enabled this theft in the first place. She knew this move would make enemies, powerful ones, but she didn't care. If taking them down meant protecting others from suffering the same fate, then she was willing to face whatever consequences came her way. Meanwhile, living in the same house as her opponent added a strange layer of tension to her life. The house itself was beautiful, a sprawling two-story structure with large windows and a cozy backyard. But it wasn't home to her. It was a battlefield, a place where psychological warfare played out daily. Her opponent tried everything to unsettle her. Loud arguments late at night, sudden complaints to local authorities about noise violations, and even attempts to intimidate her by showing up unannounced. None of it worked. She remained calm, composed, and always 3 steps ahead. She redecorated the house, rearranging furniture and painting walls in bold colors. Each change felt like a small victory, a way of asserting her presence. She hosted gatherings, inviting friends and neighbors over for dinner parties and casual get-togethers. Word spread quickly around town about how she was handling the situation. Some people admired her courage, others thought she was crazy. Either way, she didn't let it bother her. What mattered most was staying focused on the endgame. As the weeks turned into months, the pressure on her opponent grew unbearable. Their financial troubles worsened, thanks in part to her strategic moves. She made sure the house stayed in pristine condition, ensuring no opportunity for them to accuse her of neglecting the property. She paid utility bills on time, maintained the garden, and kept meticulous records of every expense. Everything she did was calculated, designed to show that she was in control, not just of the house but of the entire situation. Her opponent's frustration became increasingly obvious. There were moments when they snapped, yelling accusations and threats, but she never retaliated. Instead, she smiled politely, letting their anger work against them. She knew that losing composure was a sign of weakness, and she intended to exploit every crack in their armor. During this time, she continued building her case. Alongside the evidence provided by the whistleblower, she gathered testimonials from neighbors and former employees who had witnessed the deceit firsthand. Slowly but surely, the pieces of the puzzle came together. Her lawyer assured her that they were closing in, that the tide was finally turning in their favor. Yet, she refused to celebrate prematurely. She had learned the hard way that nothing was certain until it was officially signed, sealed, and delivered. One evening, as she sat on the porch watching the sunset, she reflected on how far she had come. From feeling powerless and betrayed to reclaiming her strength and dignity, the journey had transformed her. She wasn't the same person she used to be. Life had forced her to grow tougher, smarter, and more resilient. And though the scars of betrayal still lingered, she carried them as reminders of what she had overcome. The road ahead was uncertain, but she was ready to face whatever challenges lay in store, ready to fight until the bitter end, and ready to prove that sometimes the greatest victories are born out of the deepest pain. The house she now owned became more than just a place to live. It was her battlefield, her fortress, and her weapon all rolled into one. Every morning, as sunlight streamed through the windows, she reminded herself why she had bought it in the first place. This wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming control. Control over her life, her land, and the future she had almost lost. But living under the same roof as the person who had betrayed her, that was a test of patience, willpower, and strategy. Her opponent, let's call them the other side for simplicity, wasn't happy about the situation. At first, they tried to act like nothing had changed. They continued going about their daily routine, pretending that they were still in charge. But little by little, cracks began to show. The moment they realized she was serious about staying, their demeanor shifted. What started as subtle hostility soon turned into outright aggression. Late-night arguments erupted over trivial things: noise, levels, shared spaces, even whose turn it was to clean the kitchen sink. But she didn't rise to the bait. Instead, she remained calm, always polite, and infuriatingly composed. One evening, after another pointless argument, she decided to take things up a notch. She hired painters to come in and repaint the entire house. Bright colors replaced neutral tones, giving the space a fresh, vibrant feel. It wasn't just an aesthetic choice, it was a statement. a reminder that this house belonged to her now. When the other side walked in and saw the changes, their face turned red with anger. They stormed into her room, demanding explanations. She simply smiled and said, "I'm improving my property. Isn't that what owners do?" That small exchange set the tone for everything that followed. From then on, every decision she made was deliberate, a calculated move designed to unsettle her opponent. She rearranged furniture, installed new locks, and even threw dinner parties without inviting them. Friends and neighbors would gather in the living room, laughing and chatting while the other side seethed in frustration upstairs. These gatherings weren't just social events, they were a way of asserting dominance. Everyone in town knew what was happening, and whispers spread like wildfire. Some people sympathized with her, others thought she was playing a dangerous game. Either way, she didn't care. All that mattered was keeping the pressure on. But it wasn't all fun and games. Living in such close quarters with someone who hated her guts took its toll. There were nights when she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she was pushing things too far. Was she crossing a line? Could she handle the fallout if things spiraled out of control? Doubts crept in, but she pushed them aside. This fight wasn't just about her anymore. It was about proving a point. About showing that no matter how powerful or cunning someone might be, they couldn't get away with stealing from others. As the weeks went by, she noticed subtle changes in her opponent's behavior. They became quieter, more withdrawn. Gone were the loud confrontations and dramatic outbursts. In their place was a simmering tension, a constant undercurrent of unease. She could see it in their eyes, the weight of guilt, fear, and desperation. For years, they had operated behind a mask of confidence and charm, manipulating people and situations to suit their needs. But now, that mask was slipping, and she intended to rip it off completely. To keep the momentum going, she doubled down on her efforts outside the house. Armed with evidence collected from the whistleblower and her own investigations, she filed additional complaints against not only her opponent, but also those complicit in the scheme. Local officials, developers, and even bank employees found themselves under scrutiny. Rumors swirled around town, and suddenly everyone involved wanted nothing to do with the mess. Her opponent's network of allies began crumbling, leaving them isolated and vulnerable. She also reached out to journalists, sharing her story carefully and strategically. Media attention brought both risks and rewards. On one hand, it put her in the spotlight, making her actions subject to public judgment. On the other hand, it forced accountability. People started asking questions, not just about her case, but about corruption in general. Articles appeared in local newspapers shedding light on shady land deals and unethical practices. Public opinion shifted and support for her cause grew stronger. Back at the house, tensions reached a boiling point. One day, after yet another heated argument, her opponent snapped. They accused her of harassment, threatened legal action, and even hinted at involving the police. But she stood firm, knowing full well that none of their threats held water. Everything she did was within her rights as the homeowner. If anything, it was her opponent who was violating the terms of their agreement by refusing to leave peacefully. Frustrated and cornered, her opponent resorted to desperate measures. They began spreading lies around town, painting her as unstable and vindictive. Some people believed the stories, while others dismissed them as attempts to deflect blame. Either way, she refused to let it affect her. She focused on the bigger picture, reminding herself that truth and justice would prevail in the end. Despite the chaos, moments of clarity kept her grounded. Late at night, when the house was quiet and everyone else was asleep, she would sit by the window and reflect on how far she had come. From feeling powerless and betrayed to reclaiming her strength and dignity, the journey had transformed her in ways she never imagined. She wasn't the same person she used to be. Life had forced her to grow tougher, smarter, and more resilient, and though the scars of betrayal still lingered, she carried them as reminders of what she had overcome. The turning point came unexpectedly. One afternoon, as she was sorting through documents in her study, she received a phone call from her lawyer. The voice on the other end was filled with excitement. "We've got them," he said. New evidence had surfaced, financial records linking her opponent directly to illegal transactions. It was the smoking gun they had been waiting for. With this latest development, the case was finally moving forward. Relief washed over her, but she didn't allow herself to celebrate just yet. There was still work to be done, battles to win, and justice to serve. As she hung up the phone, she glanced out the window. The field stretched endlessly, bathed in golden sunlight. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of hope. Hope that the land her family had cherished for generations would soon be hers again. Hope that the betrayal she had endured would not define her forever. And hope that, no matter what challenges lay ahead, she had the strength to face them head on. With renewed determination, she stepped outside, breathing in the fresh air. The road ahead was uncertain, but she was ready. Ready to finish what she had started, ready to reclaim what was rightfully hers, and ready to prove that sometimes the greatest victories are born out of the deepest pain. The case was finally gaining momentum, and with the new evidence in hand, it felt like the tide was turning. But that didn't mean the fight was over, not by a long shot. If anything, the pressure intensified. Her opponent knew they were backed into a corner, and desperation makes people do unpredictable things. Every day brought a fresh challenge, a new attempt to throw her off balance. Yet she stood firm, refusing to let anyone or anything distract her from the goal she had set for herself. Living under the same roof as her opponent had become an intricate dance of strategy and endurance. She had turned the house into her territory, reclaiming every inch of it bit by bit. The changes weren't just cosmetic, they were psychological. Each time she rearranged furniture or added personal touches, it sent a clear message. This is my space now. You don't belong here anymore. And while her opponent tried to resist, their resistance only made them look weaker. Their frustration grew louder, but so did her resolve. One evening, after a particularly tense argument, she decided to host another gathering. This time, it wasn't just friends and neighbors. It was also a few key individuals who had influence in the community. Local leaders, journalists, and even some curious onlookers filled the living room. Laughter echoed through the halls, mingling with the smell of freshly cooked food. The atmosphere was warm and inviting, everything her opponent despised. As guests mingled, she subtly steered conversations toward topics like fairness, transparency, and accountability. Without directly mentioning her situation, she planted seeds of doubt about corruption and unethical behavior. By the end of the night, her opponent sat upstairs fuming silently, while everyone else left feeling inspired and more informed. But these victories came at a cost. The constant tension took its toll on her emotionally. There were days when she felt drained, overwhelmed by the weight of everything she was carrying. Living in close quarters with someone who hated her guts wasn't easy. Arguments erupted over trivial matters, a misplaced book, a creaky floorboard, even the temperature of the thermostat. But she refused to let it break her. Instead, she channeled her frustration into action. Every insult, every petty complaint, fueled her determination to see this through until the very end. Her opponent, sensing that public opinion was shifting against them, became increasingly erratic. They started filing complaints about noise, about property damage, which never actually existed, and even about harassment. But none of it stuck. Everything she did was above board, meticulously documented, and completely within her rights as the homeowner. When local authorities came knocking to investigate, they found nothing amiss. In fact, many left impressed by how well maintained the property was. It was yet another blow to her opponent's credibility. Meanwhile, the legal battle raged on. With each court hearing, the evidence stacked higher against her opponent. Bank statements, forged documents, emails detailing shady deals. It all painted a damning picture. Her lawyer worked tirelessly, presenting the case piece by piece, building an ironclad argument that left little room for doubt. Yet her opponent fought back fiercely, dragging out proceedings and throwing up roadblocks wherever possible. Delays mounted, costs soared, and patience wore thin. But she remained steadfast, knowing that persistence was key. During one particularly Grueling court session, something unexpected happened. A witness, a former associate of her opponent, testified under oath. Their words confirmed what she had suspected all along. Her opponent had orchestrated the entire scheme, manipulating others to carry out the dirty work while keeping their hands clean. The courtroom fell silent as the truth unfolded. For the first time, her opponent looked genuinely shaken. The mask of confidence slipped, revealing cracks beneath the surface. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, eager for statements. She kept her response simple and dignified. "This isn't about revenge," she said. "It's about justice. Everyone deserves to have their voice heard, and I'm standing here today to make sure mine is." Her words resonated with those listening, both in person and online. Social media buzzed with support, with hashtags like #JusticeForAll trending locally. People rallied behind her cause, sharing stories of similar struggles and offering encouragement. It was a reminder that she wasn't alone, that her fight mattered not just to her but to countless others facing injustice. Back at the house, life continued its strange rhythm. Her opponent's behavior grew increasingly erratic. Sleepless. Nights led to short tempers which spilled over into explosive arguments. One morning, unable to contain their anger any longer, they confronted her in the kitchen. "Why are you doing this?" they demanded, their voice trembling with a mix of rage and fear. "Haven't you done enough?" She paused, meeting their gaze calmly. "I'm not doing this because I want to hurt you," she replied. "I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do. Because no one should be allowed to take what doesn't belong to them and get away with it." Her words hung heavy in the air, punctuated by silence. For a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of remorse in their eyes, but it vanished quickly, replaced by bitterness. They stormed out, slamming the door behind them. She sighed, leaning against the counter. These confrontations were exhausting, but they also reinforced her conviction. She wasn't fighting for revenge. She was fighting for fairness, for herself, for her family, and for anyone else who had ever been wronged. As weeks turned into months, the strain began to show on her opponent. Once confident and commanding, they now seemed diminished, haunted by the consequences of their actions. Friends stopped visiting, business associates distanced themselves. Even their own family appeared wary, unsure of how to navigate the fallout. Meanwhile, she continued rebuilding her life, brick by brick. She decorated the house with items that reflected her personality, photos of loved ones, artwork created by local artists, plants that brought life to every corner. Slowly but surely, it started feeling less like a battleground and more like home. Then, one crisp autumn morning, the breakthrough came. Her lawyer called with news. The judge had ruled in her favor. The stolen land would be returned to her along with compensation for damages. Fraud charges were being filed against her opponent, along with several accomplices. It was a monumental victory, years in the making. Tears welled up in her eyes as she processed the magnitude of what had been achieved. Against all odds, she had won. Yet despite the joy coursing through her veins, she knew the journey wasn't entirely over. Legal battles often drag on, and there would likely be appeals and counter-appeals before everything was settled once and for all. But for the first time in years, she allowed herself to breathe, to feel hope instead of fear, to envision a future where she could focus on healing rather than fighting. That evening, she walked outside, letting the cool breeze wash over her. The fields stretched endlessly before her, bathed in the golden glow of sunset. She thought about her father, whose hard work had laid the foundation for everything she cherished. She thought about the betrayal that had tested her strength and resilience. And she thought about the countless small victories that had led her, here, to this moment of triumph. The road ahead still held challenges, but she was ready. Ready to rebuild, ready to move forward, and ready to prove that sometimes the greatest victories are born not from hatred or vengeance, but from courage, perseverance, and an unwavering belief in doing what's right. The judge's ruling was a turning point, but it wasn't the end of the story. Winning in court felt like a mountain had been lifted off her shoulders, but she knew better than to celebrate too soon. Legal victories often came with strings attached, appeals, technicalities, and delays that could drag on for months, if not years. Still, this win gave her something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Hope that justice might finally prevail. Hope that she could reclaim not just her land, but also her peace of mind. Her opponent didn't take the news well. When the verdict was announced, they looked like someone who had just been punched in the gut. Their face turned pale, their hands trembled, and for a moment they seemed frozen in place. Then came the anger, a fiery, uncontrolled rage that spilled out in sharp words and accusations. They stormed out of the courtroom, shouting about how unfair everything was, how they were being targeted, how none of this made sense. Reporters followed them, snapping photos and asking questions, but they brushed past everyone without answering. Later that day, as she sat alone in the house, she thought about her opponent's reaction. Part of her felt sorry for them, not because she believed they deserved sympathy, but because she understood what it meant to lose control. She had been there once, blindsided by betrayal and robbed of everything she held dear. Now the tables had turned, and she was the one holding all the cards. It was a strange feeling, almost surreal, like stepping into a role she never imagined playing. But pity wasn't going to stop her from seeing this through. The legal battle wasn't over yet, and she couldn't afford to let her guard down. Her lawyer warned her that her opponent would likely file an appeal, dragging things out further. So instead of resting on her laurels, she doubled down on her efforts. She continued gathering evidence, documenting every interaction and preparing for whatever came next. This fight wasn't just about winning. It was about making sure no one could ever undo what she had fought so hard to achieve. Living in the Bidr, same house as her opponent, became even more tense after the ruling. They lashed out in unpredictable ways, slamming doors, muttering insults under their breath, or simply giving her icy stares whenever their paths crossed. But she refused to engage. Every insult, every glare, only fueled her determination. She reminded herself why she was doing this, not to hurt them, but to right a wrong, to prove that actions have consequences and that stealing from others doesn't go unpunished. One evening, as she prepared dinner in the kitchen, her opponent walked in unannounced. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air was thick with tension, heavy enough to cut with a knife. Finally, they broke the silence. "You think you've won, don't you?" they said, their voice low and bitter. "You think this is over?" She turned to face them, meeting their gaze head-on. "It's not about winning," she replied calmly. "It's about fairness. You took something that didn't belong to you, and now you're facing the consequences. That's all this is." Her words hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. Her opponent stared at her for a long moment, then shook their head and walked away. As the door slammed shut behind them, she exhaled deeply, leaning against the counter. These confrontations were exhausting, but they also reminded her of how far she had come. Once she would have crumbled under such pressure. Now she stood firm, unshaken by threats or tantrums. As days passed, her opponent's behavior grew increasingly erratic. Sleepless nights turned into restless days, and their frustration boiled over in unexpected ways. One morning she found notes taped to the fridge, angry scribbles accusing her of harassment and demanding she leave the house immediately. Another time she discovered belongings moved around or hidden, as if someone were trying to unsettle her. But none of it worked. Instead of reacting, she documented everything, building a paper trail that proved their instability. If anything, their actions only strengthened her case. Meanwhile, public opinion continued to shift in her favor. Local newspapers ran follow-up, stories about the case highlighting the corruption and deceit her opponent had tried to cover up. Social media buzzed with support, with strangers reaching out to share words of encouragement. People admired her resilience, her refusal to back down despite overwhelming odds. Some even called her a hero, though she didn't see herself that way. To her, she was just someone fighting for what was right, for herself, for her family, and for anyone else who had ever been wronged. Despite the growing support, she remained focused on the bigger picture. Winning the court case was important, but it wasn't enough. She wanted accountability, not just for her opponent, but for everyone involved in the scheme. Developers, bankers, officials, they all played a part in enabling the theft. And she intended to expose them all. With her lawyer's help, she filed additional complaints naming names and presenting evidence that implicated the entire network. The domino effect was undeniable. One by one, those complicit in the fraud began distancing themselves from her opponent, desperate to save their own reputations. Back at the house, life took on a surreal quality. Days blurred together, filled with moments of tension interspersed with small victories. She redecorated again, adding personal touches that made the space feel truly hers. Photos of her family adorned the walls, plants brought color to every room, and soft lighting created a warm, welcoming atmosphere. Each change was symbolic, a reminder that she was reclaiming not just the house, but also her life. Her opponent watched silently, their resentment palpable but powerless. Then came the day when the final blow landed. Her opponent, overwhelmed by mounting pressure, made a desperate move. They attempted to negotiate, offering to settle privately in exchange for dropping all charges. At first, she considered it. After all, settling would mean putting an end to the endless legal battles and allowing her to focus on rebuilding. But, deep down, she knew accepting a deal would be letting them off the hook. Justice required full accountability, not compromise. When she rejected their offer, her opponent snapped. In a heated confrontation, they admitted to everything, the forged documents, the bribes, the lies, all while pleading for leniency. It was a moment of raw vulnerability, one that revealed the cracks beneath their polished exterior. For years, they had operated behind a facade of charm and confidence, manipulating people and situations to suit their needs. Now, stripped of power and allies, they stood exposed, their true nature laid bare. The confession was both satisfying and heartbreaking. Satisfying because it confirmed everything she had suspected all along. Heartbreaking because it underscored the depth of their betrayal, not just of her, but of trust itself. As she listened to their words, she felt a mix of emotions: anger, sadness, and a strange sense of closure. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the truth, spoken aloud for everyone to hear. With the confession recorded and handed over to her lawyer, the last pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Fraud charges were formally filed, and her opponent's assets were frozen pending investigation. Friends and associates abandoned them, leaving them isolated and defeated. Meanwhile, she focused on healing. Slowly but surely, she began imagining a future free from bitterness and resentment. A future where she could walk through her fields without feeling the weight of betrayal. A future where she could rebuild, not just her land, but also her spirit. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she stepped outside and took a deep breath. The air smelled fresh, tinged with the promise of renewal. She thought about her father, whose legacy she had fought so hard to protect. She thought about the sacrifices she had made and the lessons she had learned along the way, and she thought about the countless people who had stood by her side, cheering her on when the odds seemed insurmountable. The road ahead still held challenges, but she was ready. Ready to embrace whatever came next with courage and grace. Ready to prove that sometimes the greatest victories are born not from hatred or vengeance, but from resilience, integrity, and an unwavering belief in doing what's right. The dust had finally settled. After years of relentless fighting, sleepless nights, and emotional battles, she stood victorious. The court's final ruling left no room for appeals or loopholes. Her opponent was found guilty on multiple counts: fraud, forgery, and unethical business practices. The stolen land was officially returned to her, along with a hefty compensation that would help rebuild what had been lost. But more than the legal victory, it was the sense of closure that brought her peace. For the first time in years, she could look at the horizon without feeling the weight of betrayal pressing down on her chest. Her opponent, once so confident and untouchable, was now a shadow of their former self. Stripped of wealth, influence, and reputation, they disappeared from town almost overnight. Some said they moved to another state to start over. Others whispered about them living in obscurity, burdened by shame. Whatever the truth, she didn't care. Their fate wasn't her concern anymore. What mattered was that justice had been served, not just for her but for everyone who had ever been wronged by their greed and deceit. With the house now entirely hers, she decided to transform it into something meaningful. It wasn't just a building. It was a symbol of resilience, a testament to how far she had come. She hired local workers to renovate the place, turning it into a cozy retreat where people could gather, share stories, and find inspiration. The walls were painted soft, warm colors. The garden was redesigned with vibrant flowers and lush greenery, and the living room became a space for community events. Every detail reflected her journey, from the artwork created by friends to the furniture crafted by local artisans. This wasn't just her home anymore. It was a sanctuary for anyone seeking hope and renewal. As word spread about what she had done, the house quickly became a hub of activity. Neighbors stopped by to congratulate her, sharing meals and laughter. Journalists wrote articles about her story, calling her a beacon of strength and determination. People from neighboring towns visited, eager to learn how she had overcome such overwhelming odds. At first, she felt uncomfortable being called an inspiration, but over time she realized the importance of her story. If sharing her experience could give even one person the courage to stand up against injustice, then every struggle had been worth it. But rebuilding wasn't just about the physical spaces, it was also about healing herself. The scars of betrayal ran deep, and though the wounds had closed, they still lingered beneath the surface. To truly move forward, she knew she needed to let go of the anger and resentment that had fueled her fight for so long. Letting go didn't mean forgetting. It meant choosing forgiveness, not for her opponent, but for her own sake. Carrying hatred would only keep her tied to the past, preventing her from embracing the future. One afternoon, as she sat on the porch, overlooking the fields, she reflected on everything she had learned. This journey had taught her lessons she never expected, about resilience, patience, and the power of standing firm in the face of adversity. She had discovered strengths she didn't know she possessed, pushed boundaries she thought were impossible to cross, and emerged stronger than ever before. But perhaps the most important lesson was this: life isn't always fair, but fairness can be fought for. Justice doesn't happen on its own. It requires effort, sacrifice, and unwavering belief. She also came to appreciate the people who had supported her along the way, friends who had stood by her side when the world seemed against her, strangers who had reached out with kind words and encouragement, even those who had doubted her but later apologized, admitting they had underestimated her resolve. These connections reminded her of the goodness in humanity, even in the darkest times. They showed her that while some people may betray you, there will always be others willing to lift you up. Reclaiming her land felt like coming home in ways she hadn't anticipated. Walking through the fields, she remembered her father, the man who had taught her the value of hard work and integrity. His voice echoed in her mind, reminding her of the legacy he had entrusted to her. As she touched the soil, she felt a profound connection to him, as if he were standing beside her, proud of everything she had achieved. It was a bittersweet moment, filled with both joy and longing. Joy for having honored his memory, and longing for the wisdom he might have offered during her toughest days. In the months that followed, she focused on giving back to the community that had supported her. She organized workshops for young farmers, teaching them sustainable practices and the importance of protecting their land. She hosted fundraisers to support families facing similar injustices, using her platform to amplify voices that might otherwise go unheard. And she mentored women who, like her, had been betrayed or taken advantage of, showing them that they too could rise above their circumstances. Her story became a legend in the town, a tale of courage, perseverance, and triumph against all odds. Parents told it to their children as a reminder that standing up for what's right is always worth it, no matter how difficult the path may seem. Teachers used it as an example of resilience, encouraging students to believe in themselves even when the world tries to knock them down. and activists cited it as proof that change is possible when people refuse to stay silent. Yet, despite the admiration and praise, she remained humble. She knew her victory wasn't just hers alone. It belonged to everyone who had believed in her, stood by her, and helped her along the way. Without them, she wouldn't have made it this far. So, she continued living simply, cherishing the small joys in life. Sunsets over the fields, laughter shared with loved ones, and quiet moments of reflection. Late one evening, as she watched the stars twinkle in the sky, she thought about the future. There were still challenges ahead, of course. Life was unpredictable and nothing was guaranteed. But she faced them with confidence, knowing she had already overcome the impossible. Whatever came next, she was ready. Ready to dream bigger, reach higher, and continue making a difference in the world around her. This chapter of her life had ended, but a new one was just beginning. A chapter filled with hope, purpose, and endless possibilities. As she closed her eyes and drifted off to sleep, she smiled, feeling grateful for everything she had fought for and everything she had yet to achieve.